Hello, everyone. My name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and we're thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Chandra Manning, professor over at Georgetown University. Welcome, Chandra.
Thank you very much, John. I'm glad to be here with you. It's nice to have, other human beings to talk to.
That's right. That's right. It very much is. And on that subject of talking to other folks, it's been wonderful to connect with you, the people tuning into these videos, both our pre-recorded interviews and our live videos. It's been wonderful to see some of the same names popping up over and over again. It's nice to form a little bit of community in the midst of this time of physical distancing. And on that note, our doors are closed at the museum, and thank you so much to those of you who have donated or decided to become a member of the museum during this COVID-19 pandemic. It really means the world to us. If you haven't yet and you've enjoyed all the video content that we've been able to produce, encourage you to make a donation, become a member of the museum. It's things like that that allow us to keep bringing programs like this to you. So if you are able to do that, that'd be great. If you're not at a point where you can do that financially right now, even just something as simple as liking us on Facebook, sharing these videos with your friends, subscribing to our YouTube channel, that makes a big difference as well. So do what you can to help us if you're enjoying the videos. And most of all, we're just glad you're here, and we hope that these can bring a little bit of life to your day. And one of the mantras we've been saying during this time is that there is hope in history, and we're trying to bring some of that to you all. So with that, we're going to get started talking to Chandra here. So start off, tell us a little bit about yourself, some of your research interests, and the inspiration for the project that I didn't talk about at all, that we're going to be talking about today. Yes, so Chandra's here. She's a woman of many talents. She's written all kinds of fantastic books that you all should go read, including but not limited to When This Cruel War Is Over, Troubled Refuge, and more. But for our purposes, she's a critically acclaimed blog author and has written for the museum a couple times. And she wrote about this is getting pretty meta here. She wrote about the making of an incredible digital resource entitled Escaping Slavery, Building Diverse Communities, the search for freedom in the capital region since the Civil War. It's just this incredible resource, which we're going to get into in a little bit, made by one of her history classes. So tell us a little bit about yourself and the origins of the project, and kind of what inspired you to kind of tackle this.
Sure. I teach history at Georgetown. I teach chiefly 19th century U.S. history with a focus on slavery, Civil War, and emancipation. My own research has also been on those topics. The two books that you mentioned, for example, one of them tries to dive deep into what Civil War soldiers think about slavery. And then the second book examines the phenomenon of contraband camps, of enslaved men, women, and children who, in the process of the Civil War, identify the Union Army as an escape route out of slavery and run to the Union Army camps, and then spend the war, or part of the war, in these large, essentially refugee camps known as contraband camps. And so that phenomenon of the interaction between former slaves and the Union Army, and then eventually the federal government, really fascinated me. I believe that it clearly changed the fates of enslaved people, but it also changed the United States. And that mutual relationship and how those two things changed each other has been a driving force in my research and also in my teaching. I teach classes on many aspects of U.S. history, from the straight up U.S. history survey to the American Revolution to a Civil War class, a class on Lincoln, a class on the history of baseball. But in this past school year, I really wanted to dedicate a class to what historians do. I really wanted students to be able to kind of get their hands dirty and to take the plunge that historians take, to ask when we don't know if we're going to find answers, and to really create something that they could be proud of and that would tell us something we didn't know before. And I had been thinking for some time about how I might structure such a class. And then I was approached by the National Park Service, and they were interested in creating some kind of an ethno-historical source that that visitors to Washington, or just people crawling around on the internet, could consult for understanding Washington, D.C., and in particular, understanding the communities of formerly enslaved men, women, and children who come to Washington during the war, and then what becomes of the neighborhoods and the communities that they build in the years after the war. So really they wanted a kind of longitudinal history of Washington, D.C., with the main character being these former slaves and their descendants. And so these two things, what the Park Service wanted in a way that I was trying to create opportunities for my students, came together perfectly. And so in the fall of 2019, I taught a class called Finding DC's Civil War African American Communities. And what the students did was build a story map, telling the stories of the people that they had discovered in the archives. And with your permission, I'll share that with you now.
Absolutely, please do. And I should note that the blog post on the clairebartonmuseum.org, this database is linked to through the blog post that Dr. Manning wrote about its creation. So you can find it there as well, and we'll be sure and link to this in the comments of this video when it gets posted.
So here it is. Here is their creation. And we can talk a little bit about what they found, and that's really interesting, but also how they found it, I think, is interesting too. What everybody in the class did was become an expert on a particular neighborhood within the capital region for a particular time period. And so every single student in that class took ownership of a particular plot of ground in a set of years, and they became the experts. But rather than write a research paper about the Washington Navy Yard or about Freedman's Village at what's now Arlington Cemetery, or about Capitol Hill, they created something called a story map. Using ArcGIS and Esri and those kinds of technologies, they were responsible for finding sources and for allowing those sources to lead them to the story that they wanted to tell. That was the first thing they had to do, and then they had to learn this technology. We learned it right along with each other, where they used the story map technology to tell their story, to figure out a way to convey what they had discovered using maps and using data and using images. So we'll look at this one for a moment right here. Here is a story map on Mason's Island. And Mason's Island now is we know it better as Roosevelt Island. It's in the Potomac River, not very far from Roslyn, kind of between Washington and Virginia. And for a time during the Civil War, it served as a contraband camp. And so one of our students chose Mason's Island, and she was going to become the expert on Mason's Island. So she had to figure out, how do you find out about Mason's Island? And that was the beauty of the class is I didn't hand them a file of sources. We spent a lot of time in class talking about how do you find sources and where might you look, but they were in charge of finding them.
And that's just so beautiful, because sometimes people will come to me like, oh, John, you have a history degree. You must know everything that's ever happened in the history of the world. But what I think is the true, which obviously I don't, the true value of a history degree is I might not know a lot about you know, certain areas of history, but I know how to go about finding information about them. And so I love that this class is kind of just as much about the information as it is learning how to find the information.
Oh, it absolutely was. And I should be honest and say that for some students, that was actually a frustrating aspect of the class.
Sure.
I told them right up front on the first day, I trust you're going to learn a lot about some neighborhood in the capital region. And I trust you're going to learn a lot about emancipation. And I trust you're going to learn a lot about the Civil War and about Washington. But what I know you're going to learn a lot about is being a historian. And historian means living with uncertainty. It means taking a leap of faith. It means asking a question when you don't know if you're going to find an answer. And so we spent time learning how to use finding aids, and we spent time identifying resources in the Washington area and compiling operating hours and how do you get a library card. And we spent time working with search engines. So I like to think that I helped them all develop their toolboxes, but when it came time to use those toolboxes, it was up to them. And there were definitely students who found that very, very frustrating and very difficult, because there are days where you go to the archives and you might put in 3 hours, you might put in 8 hours, and you might come out with nothing except for, you know, a sneezy nose from the dust in the archives. And that really frustrated some students. That things didn't always go according to plan, or they didn't find exactly what they wanted, or the sources said something different than they expected. And to do this project really required each of them at some point to live with the discomfort of uncertainty. And I think by and large, most of them came through that discomfort. And I know that they all produced really wonderful stuff. For some of them, what they learned is, yeah, history is not for me. It's dried because I'm never doing this again.
And that can be a valuable lesson too.
Exactly. And then for others, the discovery became the adventure in and of itself. That plunge into the unknown was both terrifying and exhilarating. And so was finding something that they genuinely didn't know before. And they all did that. So I happened to choose this particular one to feature, but I could have chosen any of them because they all came up with such wonderful sources and wonderful findings. And to come up with sources is one thing. To then take those sources and make a story out of them, to find a narrative arc, to find a theme that they want to convey. That's a real challenge. And they had to do it not just with topic sentences, but with the visuals that they could compile in this story map feature. So they used a number of different techniques and different devices to really tell each of their stories. They used some mapping and they used some graphics. As you can see, they used text. They had stories to tell. They had to organize their thoughts, though, they had to organize the thoughts in a way that did not assume someone was going to read straight through. So they had to be very intentional about the most important things that they wanted to convey and the order in which they should be conveyed. And so they compiled things like quotations from newspapers. So they found maps from the day. They used a number of different types of documents, particularly Army documents, to convey the Army's interaction with men, women, and children who entered camps. And what each of them did, or what most of them did that was really impressive, was that they allowed themselves to be surprised. They allowed themselves to be astonished. And that sense of excitement and astonishment was one of the best things to come out of the class. I'm scrolling through faster than you can read, I know, but I do want to convey the sense of each person created something this extensive. And every story they told was its own story, and it was in many ways unique. And so one thing that we have in this story map is 15 very unique and varied and diverse stories. Let me go back to the main page if I can. So we have a story about the freed Black population in Washington before the war, told through the eyes of one particular family. And we have a story about Washington's Navy Yard. The Navy Yard is one of the first places where formerly enslaved Black men in particular ran for refuge. We have a story about hospitals, another place that provided and that turned out to be a source of employment.
Right, and of probably a special interest to our Civil War medicine audience.
Exactly. I think that's probably the one I should have done for you. Sorry about that. Maybe we'll go back to that one at the end. And then we had the story that I showed you about Mason's Island. I think I went over one of the first camps to form was Camp Barker near where Logan Circle is right now. We had a student work on that neighborhood. Freedman's Village was an encampment which became as a village, a planned village, on the grounds of what's now Arlington Cemetery. And we had 3 students dive very deeply into that neighborhood, not just in the Civil War years, but right up to the present. Right across the river, Alexandria, Virginia, was another recipient of many refugees from slavery. Georgetown, where we were located, as it turned out, had a large Black population during and after the Civil War. And this was a revelation to Georgetown students. The neighborhood looks much different, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the students told that story. Murder Bay was a neighborhood I'd never heard of, but it was a kind of near where Federal Triangle is now. It turned out to be a fascinating neighborhood, from the outset painted as a den of crime, but had made its own kind of community. And then other students took the story forward in time. One student dove deeply into the creation of Howard University, founded during Reconstruction, as a site of higher education for African Americans, including some former slaves. And she found a fascinating story of some tensions that begin during the war itself between pre-war residents, a free Black community, really striving to hold and maintain its foothold in Washington, D.C., and then these newcomers. And those two communities sometimes had many interests in common, and other times experienced some friction. And she found some of those same frictions in the story of Howard, which was fascinating. And another student dove deeply into Capitol Hill, which was a settling site for many more former slaves than we had realized, and also gave us an opportunity to think about the questions of monuments and memorialization. And Washington, D.C. is full of monuments telling some part of the story of the Civil War. What about this story? How do we tell this story? Two students worked together to dive deeply into a neighborhood around Fort Reno, which is now Tenleytown, the Tenleytown region within Washington, D.C., kind of towards the Maryland border. Fort Reno had been a U.S. Army installation in the defenses of Washington. A ring of forts surrounded the city, and those forts became sort of a point of entry for former slaves running to the Union Army. Around one of them in particular, this thriving African-American community really took root, and it stayed there until well into the 20th century, and then was displaced to build a high school, which would turn out to be a whites-only high school. And so students worked together to tell that story. And this is a wonderful example, I think, of using an image to tell part of their story. They showed this image here of a fire hydrant in the middle of a blank open field. Why is a fire hydrant in the middle of a field?
Right.
Right, that was a street. There was you have fire hydrants where there are communities, and there was a whole residential community displaced there, and they tell that story. Another student looked deeply into U Street, the U Street district in its heyday, Black Broadway in its heyday, and found direct connections from where what had been the Camp Barker region, a contraband camp, as people sort of filed out of that Camp Barker and made their more permanent homes in Washington, D.C., he found direct connections with this U Street district and some early Black businesses. And then finally, one student looked at another neighborhood that, again, it had initially been settled by former slaves who'd come to Washington, the Barry Farm region, which still exists but is fighting tooth and nail against gentrification. And she became quite involved and close with many of the advocates in that ongoing struggle. So she attended community action meetings and really got to know people directly connected to this struggle today. And I'm going through each of these individual stories on purpose to make one of the points I'd like to make here, and that is that the students really found a very diverse array of experiences. They found that leaving slavery and coming to the capital region didn't tell just one story. It told many, many stories that could end in many different ways. They could end, and sometimes did end, with obtaining freedom, with getting a foothold in the city, with a step up on a ladder that might take them to Howard University or to a business in U Street. But an awful lot of them found disease, and they found betrayal, and they found a Union Army that was an inconstant ally. They found overcrowded conditions. Their grasp for freedom ended less in liberation and more in, disease or death or disappointment. And all of these stories happening side by side led to a narrative that we can't reduce to a single beginning, middle, end, but did, I think, lead to a whole that was more than just the sum of its parts. And so everybody's map, therefore, got embedded within one big class story map. And that story map works quite hard to tell a story that has some overarching themes, but does not reduce the individual experiences to some sort of a false
it doesn't tie it up with a bow.
Exactly. There are no bows. You will notice there are no bows. There are a couple of different ways, though, that visitors might interact with this map. One is to just scroll through, as I just did. Another is to pick a particular map and dive deep just into that. Another way is at the bottom here, we have a current day map of the DC region, and each of these pins represents an area or a neighborhood that one of the students delved deeply into. And you can click on those pins to go straight to that map. That's one way of interacting. Oh, I don't know if it let you go to the map or not, but it took me to the.
Yeah, we saw it.
Okay, good. Another way that one might interact with this map is through the authors.
Mm-hmm.
Very beginning of the semester, what we did was head downtown to Washington, D.C. We're in Washington. We headed into downtown Washington to where Camp Barker, the first sort of the nucleus for band camp settlement in Washington, D.C. was, again, near where Logan Circle is now. Very near where the Civil War African American Museum is and where the Civil War African American Monument is. So we began by literally walking around Washington, D.C. and looking at the streets. There's no concrete evidence now of much of what was there then, but at least to place ourselves geographically where some of these stories unfolded. So another way to interact with the map is to go to the picture of all of the many authors of this map and then click on their names. And that would also take you straight to their contribution to this map.
Very cool. Yeah, what an incredible resource. I mean, it is just incredibly vast. And I love the overlay with, the modern day map of DC. It really kind of paints a picture that, in some ways is similar to the way things are now, and in some ways very different. And one of the things that I think is the most exciting about all this is, so many studies of, Civil War era topics pretty much end when the Civil War ends. Or perhaps they go a bit into Reconstruction. But I love that this one continues. I mean, as historians, what we do a lot of the time is, trying to draw connections from the past to the present, and, see how the past influences where we are today. But a lot of times, for all that lip service we give it, we kind of let the ways the past influences the present be kind of implicit, or leave it to the subtext. But this kind of draws it, more out to the forefront, which I think is good and an important thing to do.
Right, and I really want to underscore that as the student's achievement. I mean, in my own published work, I'm among the guilty. I tend to stop in maybe December 1865. I don't really continue the sustained narrative, at least beyond that point. So that is, I agree with you. That's one of the beauties of this project, is that the students really did continue to follow these threads, and they did it organically too. And I think that's one of the reasons for the success of the project, is they didn't start from now and say, walk backwards with an expectation of what they would find. They didn't do an origins, for example, because when we ask origins questions, we sometimes shape our answers to notice the things that are like now. But that's not what they did. They started in the past and then they walked forward. And I think that approach allowed them to really be led by what they found in the evidence, especially when it didn't jive with what they expected. And that happens sometimes. The students who found, the student who found tensions within communities in Howard University, for example, not at all, which he had anticipated finding, and it took courage to allow those findings to really direct where she went with her project.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a good way to do it, because, if you start from the present and kind of work your way backwards, then you can sort of trap yourself sometimes, just like you said. Let me see here. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges in kind of making sure that you bring African-American voices to the forefront of a project like this?
Yeah, so,
I mean, they're certainly out there, but at times I know the sourcing can be kind of troubling to find. So talk about how that all worked.
yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that question. It was something we had to be very intentional about. Many of the sources that are easiest to find are going to tell this story through the eyes of the federal government or the Army. That's what you're going to find fastest, and those are going to be predominantly white sources. And they're going to tell you valuable things, to be sure, but they're going to be telling us the stories of the people we're most interested in through some other than their own. So we had to think a lot about what to do about that. And one answer was to look in at those very source collections within the Congressional Globe, or run under the Congressional Record, and in Army documents. You'd be surprised at how often a government official or an Army official would interview a former slave or someone who's come through the lines, particularly if they were coming through the lines and might have some military intelligence about the surrounding area. So sometimes transcribed interviews would provide the voices of people, and that was especially true when Congress, or the Senate more than the House, but Congress would launch inquiries into things. They would sometimes bring witnesses, and you could find voices that way. In 1863, I believe, the Secretary of War and Congress jointly authorized something called the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission. And its purpose was to fan out to these contraband camps, which existed wherever the Union Army was, not just in Washington, and investigate conditions in these camps. And they did those investigations through a series of interviews with Army personnel, to be sure, but also with some former slaves themselves. So those interviews, those are all transcribed there in the National Archives. That was another source. A third source, again, a government source, but you could find former slaves' voices there, were Civil War pension records. In Civil War pension records, if a man had fought in the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, and then later applied for a pension, typically, if he applied, or more to the point, if his family applied for survivors' benefits, typically what you would need were things like marriage certificates and birth certificates, things that former slaves didn't have by virtue of slavery. And so instead, what they would have to do is provide affidavits describing their family relations, describing their backgrounds, describing what they did during the war. So pension applications sometimes had people narrating their lives in their own voices, and those were very helpful in putting this together.
Which is very much kind of a 19th century thing. One of the things that I've kind of noticed with kind of the same pension records and like is the medical examinations that go along with them. The doctors essentially have to rely on the case history provided by the patient themselves, because there's nothing else they can really lean on, unlike how things are today.
Yes, exactly. So in some cases, no one at the time realized what they were doing was creating a nice rich archive of sources for us, but they did. We did draw on newspapers quite a bit, and those tended to be more white than African-American voices. But again, sometimes you would find an interview. Obituaries were a surprisingly helpful source in some cases. Some church records, particularly what a number of the students found that struck them was the vigor and longevity of African-American churches springing up quite quickly. It looks in the records spontaneously during the war. Of course, it would have been those supposedly spontaneous churches would be drawing on a deep pre-war tradition of African-American worship that had really went from underground to above ground. But they were struck by the vitality and the longevity of African-American churches, and they found those records to be helpful. So that was another source. Moving into the 20th century, it became easier to find sources in African-American voices, the business records of some of the U Street businesses, for example, the Howard University archives. And then the student who worked closely with the Berry Farm group, she could literally hear the voices when she went to meetings and talked to them. And I'd also like to say somebody who was a wonderful, wonderful help to us was Mrs. Alcyone Amos, who she is at the Anacostia Museum, and she was a tremendous, tremendous resource to us. And in many ways, particularly to the student working with Berry Farm, but she was just a well of places we might not have thought to look if she had put us to them.
Yeah, very cool, and definitely examples of kind of getting creative for looking for things for this project. Talk a little bit about the title. It's long, but I think it's good. What was who made the decision for that? Was that a group decision, and why did you ultimately decide to go with that?
It's funny that you brought that up. That took an entire class period. Very committed to that title being the collective work of the students. Parts of this map are my work. The students each did their own individual maps, but compiling it and making it into a whole and the work in between is my work. The title is not, and it was purposely not. I really wanted that to arise from their collective voices. And I'll say that there are a couple of students who, if you were to ask them what was the low point of the class, they would say the day we came up with that title. It really did take the entire class period. But I think there's something in that. It is long, and we had hoped it wouldn't be quite that long, but I think that they determined that it took that long to capture what they thought this map said. It was really important to them to convey a plurality of story, to convey a plurality of outcome, that that we not overlay a misleading homogeneity to any aspect of this map, because I would say if they were to talk about what they most learned, it would be the diversity, even disparity of experiences.
Mm. Well, it gets to the idea of no bows, even in the.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So, they did think it was important to underscore that that coming to Washington D.C., making it to Washington D.C., was to escape slavery. That was a significant that was significant. That the act of exiting the institution of slavery was needed to be highlighted, needed to be carved out. But they also wanted to make a distinction between that and achieving freedom, because they agreed that those who ran to the city got out of the institution of slavery. But what this would be a second thing that they learned if they were asked, I think. One would be multiplicity of experience. The second would be that there were more than two states. There wasn't just slavery and freedom. There was kind of a liminal in the middle. And in that liminal is where many people's experiences actually resided. You know, they did get out of slavery, but what they found and what they achieved certainly didn't match their highest aspirations for what freedom would mean. So, so the subtitle talks about the search for freedom, but it specifically calls it the search for freedom and not the achievement of freedom. The building diverse communities in the title was important too, because another, and this says a third thing they found, is that that while a person exiting slavery might be an individual experience, that would be a milestone in an individual's life, that nobody made it on their own, and that when formerly enslaved people are facing the long odds of getting out of slavery in the first place and building new lives for themselves within a power structure built not only not to reflect their interests, but to deny their interests, that an individual up against that power structure didn't stand a chance, that it really took a community for survival. And sometimes that expressed itself in a church, and sometimes a neighborhood, and they didn't all look the same. But that the story was almost never an individual story. It was always the story of the community. And they really wanted to convey that in the title too. And then they wanted people to know when and where we were talking about. So that's where the capital region and civil war. Right. So the fact that it took me that long to talk to you about the title, I hope is exactly how deep and sometimes contentious, I'll tell you, sometimes very contentious, our discussion about the title was.
Yeah, I'm definitely getting that. And, you know, a project as extensive and detailed as this, I mean, it's clear as you're scrolling through it that everything is where it's supposed to be. It's all intentional, you know, not too much, if anything, in here is accidental, and that
Right.
definitely comes across. Well, obviously the class is over, but the project lives on, and you know, we're looking at it now, and hopefully we'll be able to look at it 100 years from now or even beyond. What are your hopes for the project as it continues its life?
I have a couple of hopes, and I think the students would say they do too. One is we certainly hope it will inspire people to go find more stories. And in fact, that's how we conclude, is by saying there's no way we found everything. And we know we haven't found everything. And this is less a completed story and more a beginning of one, and one that all of us share. And so we hope that we hope someone gets inspired to look into their own neighborhood, or to discover the story that we missed. We hope people will be inspired to add to what we have found here. And that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that I hope that it leads people to look at Washington, D.C. with somewhat different eyes. If you live in there, or if you come to visit, you can see Arlington Cemetery and Arlington House. You can't miss them. I mean, you can't miss them all. And all of those things matter, and they're important in the history of DC and of our country, but there are a lot of hidden stories that you need to know to look for. And I love it if what this map did was alert people to how much more there is to look for if they come to Washington. And then finally, I'd love a lot of people to look at this map and see the students' work. I had write to me, one of the students who participated in this map was, she was from Dublin, Ireland. She was in the United States doing her sort of study abroad.
Oh, cool.
So she's back home now, but she wrote not too long ago to talk about the satisfaction of doing work for an audience larger than a single professor, of feeling like there was a contribution made here that might continue beyond the end of grading period. And so that's one of my hopes, is that people will continue to explore and examine and really, really be an audience for these students' work. They found really great stuff. And I'm just thrilled at the idea of somebody other than me being the beneficiary of it.
I understand, and I echo that particular student's sentiment. So when I was in both college, undergrad, and graduate school, those were always my favorite projects to work on, that I kind of knew would have a life beyond, just turning it in. Actually, not too long ago, someone reached out to me about one of those that I had since forgotten about. It was nice to be reminded, and nice that someone was paying attention to it. So that's wonderful.
That's terrific.
So everyone, go check out Escaping Slavery, Building Diverse Communities, Stories of the Search for Freedom in the Capital Region Since the Civil War. Next time you're in DC and you stop by the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum, maybe check out one of the neighborhoods in town. And of course, check out the blog post about the creation of this on clairebartonmuseum.org. And thank you so much, Chandra, for coming on today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yes, and thank you to all of you tuning in. Be sure to like our Facebook page, share the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, donate or become a member of the museum if you can. That's what allows us to keep bringing you videos like this. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.